So wonderful, good early afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to have you here now for the fourth of our webinars. And this time we will go to the very core of regulatory assessment of new medicines, benefit risk balance. Let's face it, in the end, that is what it is all about. And therefore, we have one session particularly dedicated to that, laying the general, partly theoretical ground for that, before we will have closer looks to that later in the sessions with examples and even more so in the oncology part. But again, laying the ground rules for the whole benefit-risk balance, we have today Francesco Pignatti, Scientific Advisor Oncology on EMA, and the oncology brain of EMA, I would say, with this kind of experience. Therefore, I immediately hand over. Francesco, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Harald, and hello, everyone. Today, the plan is to discuss basic concepts and applications in benefit risk assessment. We'll look at how this concept came about in pharmaceutical legislation, some more conceptual aspects dealing with principles, definitions, and then some applications through examples of two communication elements of the benefit risk assessment, what we call the effects table and the trade-offs. And then there should be time for summarizing and putting some questions. I remember before joining the agency, one of the first things I did was to look at the public assessment report of the first oncology drug ever approved through the centralized procedure. And to be honest, if you look at the conclusions of that report, there was no concept of benefit risk assessment. It was actually a very short report, a few pages long, and just this paragraph in the end, which was carefully crafted, a little bit like a legal text more than a clinical judgment, talking about safety and efficacy as two distinct requirements. And if you look at a similar document 30 years later, you see that that the documents have been much more comprehensive, and now there is a full section dedicated to benefit risk assessment, and it contains structure, it contains a table, it contains description of therapeutic context, and so on. So what happened in these 20, 30 years? Well, in the beginning, the concept of approval of a marketing authorization hinged on demonstration of efficacy. Then this was spelled out as an application will be refused if quality, safety, or efficacy are not demonstrated. It was only in the 70s that the concept of benefit risk was included in some of the preambles to one particular piece of legislation, where it was said that the safety can only be seen in relation to the benefits. But still, the requirement itself that an application for marketing authorization will be rejected unless the company can demonstrate a positive benefit risk only came about 20 years ago, in 2004, where positive benefit risk balance becomes a requirement for any drug authorized in the EU. And well, parallel to this, there has been also a further elaboration of the legal provisions of the type of approvals that go with this benefit risk. And there is a recognition that for certain type of approvals, there is more uncertainty that needs to be managed through, for example, post-marketing authorization, marketing obligations in the case of conditional marketing authorization. So there is this other concept of uncertainty which has been introduced. So going to summarize it, we've gone from strictly separate demonstration of quality, safety, and efficacy to introducing uncertainty and, importantly for today, introducing the concept of how these quantities, efficacy and safety typically, relate to each other. And we'll see this is not trivial because you need to introduce trade-offs, value judgments, which are often subjective. So if we want to look at a summary of this first part of the talk today, the take-home message is that the legal framework is based on rejecting an application if the legal requirements are not fulfilled. That has always been the case. But today, one of these key legal requirements, aside from quality, safety, and efficacy, is a positive benefit-risk balance. And there are different types of marketing authorizations to manage uncertainty, but what is common to all is that the benefit-risk balance has to be positive. We move now to the second part of the presentation, which is more conceptual. So bear with us for some more theoretical concepts, because well, we are used to talking about benefits and risks in kind of vernacular language of every day. We talk about pros and cons of decisions, or good things or bad things, favorable effects, undesirable effects, and so on. And really, the legislation does not help us a lot in being more formal about these definitions. It's kind of in the eye of the beholder, what is a benefit, what is a risk. The word cloud that you see on the right side of this slide is actually, when we asked a few dozen assessors, what do they consider as benefit and risk? And we got, I think, more than 90 definitions of what can, from time to time, be considered as a benefit and a risk, right? So this is one thing that we need to consider. What is a benefit? What is a risk? It's in the eye of the beholder. Now, the other thing we will talk about is comparison with different drugs. And that was also a surprise to me when I came to the agency, was that, well, the drugs, in order to be approved, don't necessarily need to be better than what's already on the market. They can be similar. And I think you've discussed this in your prior one in the previous presentations. Now, why is this strange? Well, because although formally not required a comparison to the drugs that exist, that are approved, it's actually very convenient to establish the benefit risk. So we see this kind of contradiction, not required on one hand, typically used randomized controlled trials and so on to make the benefit risk assessment. But if we attempt a general definition, I'm going to leave there without explaining too much the background. I would say that benefit risk assessment from a regulatory perspective means to answer the following question: are there any patients in the right decision context who prefer drug to placebo? The answer is yes. Then the benefit risk balance is positive. And the approved indication describes as precisely as possible the population in whom the benefit risk balance is positive. All right, now, so what's the difficulty then? Pros and cons, we do this every day. Well, the difficulty is that benefits and risks are not always expressed in terms of the same quantities. And here you have two examples. On the left, an example where it's straightforward and easy. You're comparing apples to apples. And on the right side, a more difficult situation where you're comparing apples to oranges. But let's look at the first example. The first is a drug which has, for simplifying, only two effects. One is a good effect, it saves lives in an additional 4% of patients, and the other one is it has a death as a side effect in 1% of cases. So the benefit risk in this situation is relatively straightforward because you just need to look at these quantities and see which one is greater. In this case, life saved is greater. So I would say if that's how you look at the benefits, then and a life saved is the same value as a life lost, then, well, 4% is greater than 1%. So that's relatively easy. But that's the absolute minority, and generally in oncology, it never happens to have such simple effects. What you have more often is efficacy endpoints and toxicity endpoints. For example, again, an ultra simplification would be to look at just two endpoints, 1 year survival, and improved survival probability of 5%, and a severe toxicity cumulative incidence increase by 40%. Now you have two numbers, but you can't compare them because, well, how much is one worth against each other? So that's the challenge with the benefit risk assessment. And so it isn't so much a decision. It's really it requires cognitive input, and we will see later how we structure the problem and what are all the ingredients that are necessary to tackle these more complex situations. Now, some of the more complex ingredients are the so-called value judgments, which are subjective. In fact, we did a study recently where we asked a number of myeloma patients how much they value progression-free survival compared to chronic and acute severe toxicity. And we saw a cloud of different answers, different preferences. So how much every individual values certain effects is subjective. And it's subjective for patients, but it's subjective also for regulators. So one of the determination in the benefit risk assessment is also to try to quantify how much variability there is in the preferences. And lastly, something that is not often recognized is the perspective. Because if you do benefit risk assessment from a population perspective, then, for example, you can take your clinical trial. If it's well conducted, powerful enough, and well matured, etc., representative, then you have estimates of what will happen to your population once you expose them to the drug. You will observe a certain effect in terms of perhaps survival and other effects in terms of toxicity. And you know pretty much exactly what's going to happen, at least to the limit that your trial can predict it. But that is a very different, and then you can judge whether a certain effect in a population, how much you value it against the side effects. But if you do the same benefit risk assessment from an individual patient perspective, it's quite a different proposition. Because, for example, if the drug, say, causes 20% increase in severe toxicity, from a population level, you know that 20% will suffer this effect. But if you're the patient who's going to have to take the drug, you might think, well, I'm perhaps one of the lucky ones who will not experience this side effect. Or for a benefit in terms of overall survival, you might think that, well, yes, on average, it's only 6 months effect, but perhaps for me, I'm going to be one of the lucky ones and maybe experience a 1 year improvement or 10-year improvement survival cure. So these are risk attitudes. Depending on the perspective, they matter in the benefit risk assessment. And so it is also important, especially in certain situations, to be very clear from which perspective one is doing the benefit risk assessment, which value judgments are being used, what type of uncertainty or distribution there is around the value judgment. And is it particularly important in situations where the preferences are heterogeneous. One cannot easily predict the outcome for individual patients. And there are also some extreme situations. For example, the one depicted here in the Kaplan-Meier curve that you see on the right side of the slide. You have two drugs being compared. One drug B, the blue line, has a very rapid deterioration, but if 15% of long-term survivor. So in terms of the whole population, this drug puts the whole population worse off, but there are a few gainers, so to speak, who would have cure. Now, the other drug has better off for the whole population, but has no long-term survival. You can see here, this hypothetical example, how the two prospective population individual can conflict. And as a regulator, you kind of need to take into account both and describe both, because depending on the situation, any of them could be relevant. So perspective is important. And the last thing to consider is, well, what is the role of the regulatory decision in the whole context? Again, you've touched upon this before, but here it's just a reminder that this is the regulatory decision is about putting the drug on the market if the benefit risk is positive, but then there are other decisions which are slightly different. They are dependent from the initial one because many drugs, unless they are approved by the regulators, cannot be used otherwise, for example, by the healthcare systems and so on, with exceptions and clinical trials, compassionate use and so on, other frameworks. But it's important to understand that the regulatory decision is just one in a series of decisions that lead to access. And it is important that because it's key for many subsequent decisions that the regulatory decision is communicated as clearly as possible. And independent of your role as investigators, as advisors, or whatever in the industry, wherever you are in this business, I think transparency of communication of decision is key for them to be understood and implemented. Okay, so we conclude this second, more conceptual part, and just to remember that benefit risk balance is based on the drug, on the effects of a drug compared to each other, in principle, as if no other treatment existed. A relevant question is the drug preferred to placebo? In practice, though, in many situations, one uses comparisons to assess the benefit risk. And, well, benefit risk is complex because there are many components, perspectives, subjective value judgments, and variability between individuals. Okay, so we move on to the third and last part of this talk, which is zooming into how we actually communicate the benefit risk assessment and partly how we do the benefit risk assessment. Let's say that over the years, we've recognized more and more the importance of communication because although sometimes, the benefit risk is kind of trivial, the data is so clear, clearly positive or clearly negative, but in other situations, they're less sort of self-evident, and especially when there are conflicting attributes, a little bit of benefits, but lots of risks. What do you do then? Maybe subgroups that behave completely differently, maybe people who think completely differently about these aspects. And then communication clearly becomes extremely important, not just for transparency reasons, why did you approve this drug and why not, but also for people to really make subsequent decisions, because regulators have the prerogative of scrutinizing the data, aside from doing benefit risk assessment for their decision, and transmitting this information of the scrutiny of the data, how it fits in the benefit risk assessment, how the uncertainties scrutinized from from the data impact the benefit risk assessment are hugely important. And we developed a framework largely inspired by models developed in economics and behavioral psychology, which structure the benefit risk problem or decision problems in general in a number of elements. And we will focus on the first one of them, which is the effects table. But take the time to familiarize yourself with the structure. The idea is that, first of all, one describe, and I'm talking about now, this is our assessment report template, okay? So this is what we tell our reviewers to write at the conclusion of the hundreds of pages of assessment for example, a new marketing authorization or a new indication. Describe the facts first, okay? Give us a summary of the benefits and how well described they are. Are there uncertainties? Are there gaps in knowledges? Are there particularly strengths in knowledge? But describe the facts of benefits and harms. And then summarize the key facts in a table. This is an editorial torture of our reviewers, but it isn't. It's actually an effort for clarity, because a table forces a certain standardization and numerical precision. And clarity, not only on the data, but also the choice of the critical data for the benefit risk assessment, which is already an element of assessment, because deciding out of the almost infinite number of outcomes that are studied, which are the ones that drive the assessment, and it's generally not more than a handful, that is a key information. And then once the facts are described in words, in uncertainties, in a table, we ask to describe the balance. And this is a difficult part, because this is where one is asked to express value judgments and how these fit, for example, with previous decisions and other considerations with the label, etc. Now, we're not alone in this. Many other organizations like FDA, HTA organizations have developed similar frameworks, recognizing that, well, on this critical aspect, we really need to be clear. Now, we also have developed extensive guidance on how to write these sections and the effects table. And there are two really key criteria. One is to avoid double counting, avoid unnecessarily inflating, for example, the benefits with redundant information, but also not to omit important attributes that weigh in the benefit risk balance. But having said this, being a communication tool, the report, the effects table, there is no one right way of completing an effects table. And I'm going to show you an example of what I mean here. The example is loosely based on a melanoma drug, which had a primary endpoint, which was durable response rate. There was a big difference of about 16%, if I read this correctly. And there were, as usual, a number of other endpoints: conventional response rate, survival endpoint, 12 months of survival probability, 24 months, 3-year, 4-year survival probability, etc. The usual myriad of endpoints that one could look at. And then if one was to try to convey uncertainty and problems with efficacy, one could use this example, in which one would mention just the primary endpoint, durable response rate, just the effects, some estimate of the variability, and then a long catalog of uncertainties that, well, response rate, we are not really sure whether it means anything. The difference is really small. There are subgroups that don't really look very consistent. There is a need for support from other data, but we don't have that, and so on. So this would be a way from that same data to convey uncertainty and gaps in the evidence. A completely opposite way, let's say if you want to paint a very positive picture, would be to list primary and secondary endpoints, to describe the full details, the differences and the statistical strength of the comparisons when they're primary, when they're secondary, and not dwell too much on the uncertainties. Okay, so why am I mentioning this two way of describing the same data? Well, it's really because it's a choice, and whenever we express ourselves to either favorably or unfavorably for a benefit risk balance, we need to be conscious of the communication aspect and how much we dwell on the number of different effects which are positive and the precision and the lack of uncertainties, so much more we convey a positive picture and vice versa. So in summary, on this part, on the effects table, there is no single way to complete an effects table, but it's a key part of our communication package on benefit risk. There are guidelines. They warn against unnecessarily inflating with double counting, unless this is really, there are many effects that need to be underlined to show how positive the benefit risk is, and at the same time, to not omit important attributes unless really they are not key for the benefit risk. Okay, we now move to the last part, which is the trade-offs. So far, we've described the benefit risk conceptually. We've said there's a difficult part, which is the subjective value judgments, which you need in order to compare apple and oranges, effects which are expressed in intrinsically different quantities. And well, we've seen how you describe the effects in a table, but how do you put it all together and then come to the determination that it's a positive benefit risk? Well, trade-offs are the key concept. In other words, how much one is willing to forego on one objective, say toxicity or safety, in order to gain on another objective, say efficacy. And the idea is that in most situations, the most relevant trade-offs that one needs to think of are the trade-offs of a patient discussing with their doctor about their next treatment, discussing the effects, expected effects, and well, is this treatment good for me or not? The regulators put themselves in the shoes of doctors and patients in that situation for the determination. Now, how is it done in practice? Well, this is the part where if you have a self-evident case, you don't need to spend much time. Benefit risk is obvious, positive, trade-offs are off the roof, no problem. Everybody understands that. But it's also the part where when things are narrow and conflicting attributes, benefits, but risks, then one needs to tread more carefully. I guess the most simple way of approaching this is just by simple ranking. So one could say there was a difference in survival, there was a difference in toxicity, but the difference in survival is more important than the difference in toxicity. Okay, it's not hugely transparent in terms of communication, but the job is done because you've said in terms of importance what is more important for you. A slightly more transparent approach is called thresholding, is basically saying, well, I have a 6-month improvement in survival, and I have a 40% improvement, 30% increase in toxicity. I think 40% is acceptable. I would even go so far as to say that 50% is acceptable. 70%, I'm starting to doubt, and definitely 80% grade 3-4 increase would be a no-go. Okay, that describes the threshold for the decision. It is definitely more transparent than simply saying I value one improvement, the improvement on one effect more than the other. Now, sometimes even this is not enough because there are a number of trade-offs. So now it's easy when you have just two effects, survival and toxicity. But what if you have 3 positive and 5 negative? All these trade-offs against each other, it becomes really complex. And although I've rarely seen assessors having to resort to this level of detail, but there are fully worked out quantitative solutions, both in software and even simple implementations that describe a fully quantitative model and describe the trade-offs as functions of one against each other over a range of values. And one can do all sorts of fancy stuff like play around with sensitivity analysis and so on. It's excellent, but let's say rarely needed in terms of the investment and effort to familiarize oneself with the techniques and so on. But it's there, and it's important that we know that it exists when needed. Now, there is another way that is often used for the simpler situation where it's more self-evident, which is simply to use comparison. In that way, I would call this a holistic way of doing benefit risk assessment. One isn't doing any benefit risk assessment at all. One is simply saying that if the new drug is better overall than an approved drug that is known to have a positive benefit risk, well, then obviously the new drug also must have a positive benefit risk. In fact, it doesn't even have to be better. It should be just similar or better. So if holistically an expert can judge that, yes, you know what, toxicity is more or less in the same range, efficacy, yeah, is more or less in the same range, perhaps better, that's the job done in terms of determining the benefit risk assessment. It is not quite as informative, as transparent as some of the other approaches, but it does the job. And the key here is the effort has to be proportional to the purpose here. And let's remember, it is a communication exercise. Right, so let's go deeper into the template guidance as the last exercise for today and see how they help us put in words those value judgments. And there is guidance to tell you, well, first of all, start to say, why are those key effects that you put in the effects table the important ones? So start by saying that, well, why is survival important? Well, because one of the aim of therapy is to increase survival, and then this is important. And why is grade 3-4 toxicity is important? Well, because in this setting, maybe, mild or moderate toxicity is kind of unfortunately part of everyday life, but what really changes, impacts quality of life is grade 3-4 toxicity. You need to justify why you chose those effects and the uncertainties you have around the estimates. Maybe it's a small trial, maybe some populations haven't been studied. This is the place where one needs to really be clear about evidence gaps. And then the balance itself. It is suggested that as a minimum, one give some type of idea of what is the threshold for a trade-off to be considered acceptable. In this case, 10% increase in toxicity, certainly okay. 20%, maybe more than 20. No, sorry, that's too much. That would be a very, how should I say, transparent way of expressing a trade-off. And let's look at an example which is kind of modified from an older example when we didn't have this guidance. And this is the type of language that we were trying to solve. So yes, point one in this importance of favorable effects discussion. Point 1 says the clinical objective is to delay tumor progression with the aim of postponing further therapies. Good text. It tells me why PFS in this case was considered an important endpoint. Of course, this could be much longer, and generally this is just a summary for the discussion. The gain in PFS of almost 9 months offered by whatever treatment is considered clinically meaningful. This magnitude has never been achieved by any treatment in this disease. Well, think of this. Clinically meaningful, it's a word that we use all the time. And really, when you listen to our expert meetings and advisories, it is so embedded in our jargon to say what's clinically relevant or not relevant, meaningful, important. But these words are very important in the dialogue, in the discussion, but when it comes to communicating precisely trade-offs, they don't communicate anything, really, very precise. And other things like the fact that this is the first time that we see such an effect, very interesting, but actually irrelevant because it doesn't tell us anything about how much you're willing to trade off. This fact, I continue now at point number 3. This fact will be likely translated into a benefit in terms of overall survival. Okay, interesting to know, but likely translated, this is not a place to speculate. And again, we're discussing quantifying the trade-off. Are you telling me that you're trading off survival now or PFS? Because if you're including it, then, well, we need to know how much survival you're expecting to see, likely, when you observe a 9-month PFS. So the trade-off has to be defined. Otherwise, it's just an idea, a belief. Proceeding to point number 4. The comparison in terms of overall response rate also highlights the apparent superiority of treatment versus control. Well, interesting now. So why is now the superiority even an issue? We've heard before it isn't a requirement. Now, okay, is this an important endpoint? No, you're telling me overall response is not an important endpoint. So, okay, it's superior in terms of an unimportant outcome. How is that explaining me something about the trade-off? The toxicity, proceeding to point number 5, the toxicity appears to be manageable. This is a similar, very frequent statement that we hear to saying that an effect is considered clinically meaningful. It's an absolute concept which has no clear quantity behind, and therefore is not useful to describe a trade-off precisely. Now, I've tweaked this example quite a bit in order to reveal some of these features, but you can see how important it is to be clear about the communication and to pay attention to this thing. Now, the third section in the template is, okay, now put it all together and tell us why the benefits outweigh the risk. And here, often what you find are just conclusive statements, but again, no reference to the thresholds or to the rankings that have been described as suitable strategies for describing transparently the benefit-risk assessment. So really, here, what people often misunderstand is they see the benefit-risk section as some kind of conclusion, just a statement, a confirmation of something. But no, the benefit-risk assessment is an active assessment which has to be approached in a scientific way, describing what are the ingredients, and some are facts, other are value judgments, so these have to be described for the whole assessment to be complete. And so a lot of emphasis you will see in our report, in our discussion on describing with the same rigor as we describe results of study, describe the benefit risk assessment, avoid jargon that is very useful sometimes in common parlance and debates, but when it comes to then communicating the decision, well, clinical relevance or manageability have little to convey in terms of precise trade-offs. We need to make clear distinction between what are facts and what are value judgments, because the regulators are the only one who really scrutinize the facts, and therefore other decision makers, perhaps with other value judgments, might be more interested in the fact than the fact plus the value judgment. And so the two have to be described separately. And then, because this can become awfully complex, is one want to fully quantitatively describe the problem, then one needs to be proportionate in the approach. There are self-evident cases that require little effort. There are complex cases that require a fully quantitative approach. All right, and with this, I conclude before opening for questions. I think if there are three things you want to take home from this, is that a positive benefit risk assessment is required for any marketing authorization in the EU. This means most of the time answering the question, are there any patients in the right decision context who prefer drug to placebo? And lastly, communication, clear communication, not just for being accountable for reasonable decisions and so on, but also to communicate to the other users, the other decision makers in the health system, what was the regulatory assessment that led to a positive benefit risk decision. And with this, I conclude.